welcome to the Cabin Boy Knits Woolcast. This episode is all about the Marigold. I'm going to be covering three things in this episode. The first is how to dye yarn using Marigold. The second is we're going to be using different fibres, and we're going to see how the dye bath interacts with the different fibres, and we're going to look at the color and see whether or not that makes a difference. And then the third thing we're going to do is we're going to test a theory. There are a number of papers out there arguing that whether or not you need to use a mordant when you're dyeing with Marigold. So we're going to test that theory today. So let's get going. But before we jump into the dyeing, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Marigold. The Marigold is the tajetté. That's what we're using today. And it originated in Mexico and Guatemala. And in the 16th century, Europeans came over, they loved it, brought it back to Europe and to Africa, and it just flourished because it's very hardy and it's a beautiful, beautiful flower. It also has medicinal qualities as well. So people were using the medicinal qualities, and the Cherokee used it as a dye ink. And so that's really what brought us here today. And we're going to see how it takes to yarn. So what do we need in order to create the dye bath? We need marigolds. And the ones that I have are dried marigolds. I picked these anywhere from June to September and dried them out so I could use them in the winter time. So I'm just getting around to using them now. And I'm really excited to do that. If you're going to be using freshly picked marigold, you would be using a ratio of 1:1, which means that if the weight of your yarn is 100 grams, you'd be using 100 grams of fresh cut or picked marigold. And for a dried, oftentimes in the recipes you'll see for dried marigold the ratio isn't quite the same. It's about 75% of the weight of your dried yarn. I still use a 1:1 ratio, and I love the results I get with it, so I'm sticking with that. So you need your marigold. The second thing that you need is a pot. Remember, we don't use the pots that we use for cooking. We have separate pots for dyeing. So I've got my pot here, and you'll also need a strainer because you're going to have to take the marigold out of the water after you simmer it. So you need a strainer. I have a stick. I have a measuring cup and a scale. If you have a scale, if you don't worry about it. Just eyeball it. But if you have a scale, I would use a scale as well. The other thing that's important is if you want to replicate if you really like your results and you want to replicate it, make sure that you write things down, because there are a number of variables that impact the color, like as in so many of our natural dyeing episodes, we really have to pay attention to heat. We have to look at the water source. So take notes. And I find that really helps me if I want to replicate a specific color. So, did I miss anything? I missed the yarn. We need yarn. And I think that's pretty much it. So, just go over it again. We've got our marigold. We've got our pots. We are going to be using alum as a mordant in this one because we're going to test that theory. And I'm going to use alum on all of my yarn except for one. One of them I'm going to keep separate, and we're going to see whether or not we're going to look at the color and compare the color and see if there's much of a difference. And I'm going to wash it after that. I'm going to wash it several times just to make sure that I get all the color out of it, and then we're going to look at it again and see whether or not there's any significant difference in color. We have our sifter to make sure that we separate all of the marigold from the dye pot when we are ready, just before we're going to get put our yarn in. And we have our measuring cup, a mask as well. If you want to wear a mask, that's great. And you can also use gloves. I tend to forget to use gloves when I'm dyeing with marigold because I love the feel of a very tactile person, and I end up with yellow fingers. It's kind of jaundiced looking, but it eventually wears away. So I would recommend, if you want to preserve your hands and your nails too, because it makes your nails yellow, you should wear gloves. Okay, so let's get to it. I have got my flowers, and I'm going to put them in water. I'm going to put them in here, and then cover them with water, and probably just an inch above. So I'll weigh these, put them in here, and then add some water about an inch above and let it sit overnight. Now it's time to measure the weight of our marigold. So I put my bowl on top. The yarn weighs around 450 grams, 500 grams. Let's say if it's 500 grams. And so what I'm going to do now is measure 500 grams of marigold. I like the smell of it. It smells great. So that's 120, 125. Another 125. I'm guessing that this is going to weigh pretty much the same as that did, so I think we're going to be close to 500 grams once we empty both of these. Yep. 125, and one more 125 and we're all set. Perfect. So there we have it. This is how much you'll need for 4 skeins of yarn. I've let it sit in the pot overnight, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill up the pot with water. This is well water. You can use any type of water you want. And we want to fill it right up to the... I'm going to fill it up right to about here. So I've got about an inch and a half to 2 inches from the top. Okay, this should just about do it. Perfect. Okay, we are going to let this simmer for 2 hours, and then we'll come back and we will strain it. The dye pot has been simmering for about 2 hours now, and so let's check the color. That's a nice color. I think that's it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it sit for about an hour and just have the temperature drop, and then I'm going to sift it and get all the flowers out of it, and then we're ready to go. The reason I'm going to let it sit for an hour to bring the temperature down is I want to, when I'm ready to add my yarn to the dye pot, I want to bring the temperature of the yarn very close to the temperature of the dye pot so that I don't disturb or damage the yarn. So it's time to sift the flowers out of the pot. What I like to do is I will get a cheesecloth. I've used this cheesecloth several times, and you can get multi uses out of it. And I'll put it on an old colander, and I will also use, for safety purposes, I will just put another one of these on top of it as well, because it just helps sift everything out to make sure that we don't get anything in our dye bath. If you have a few petals in your dye bath, it's not the end of the world. So let's get going. And there we have it. So just to the touch, this is pretty much room temperature. And now we're ready to add our wet yarn. And I have had my fibers soaking in warm water. It's pretty much room temperature. So the dye pot is very similar in temperature to the yarn that has been sitting here absorbing water. And the reason we put the fiber in water before we put it in our dye pot is because when you put fiber in water, it opens up. And so the fiber is nice and it's opened up now and it's ready to go in and take color from our dye pot. Now I have a few skeins of yarn that I'm going to put in here. One of them is Blue-Faced Leicester. When I'm squeezing the water, also notice I'm not turning it. Right? I'm just squeezing it out. Now you may think that this sounds a little contradictory. I just said that I'm putting it in water so that it blossoms, it opens up, so that it's ready to receive water. It still has all the water in it, a lot of water in it. I'm just squeezing the excess water out. So this is Blue-Faced Leicester. And so the Blue-Faced Leicester was put into a pre-mordant alum bath. And so what I did was I filled up a pot and I put 10% alum, so 10% the weight of the dried yarn. So if it was 100 grams, if the skein of yarn was 100 grams, I would put 10 grams of alum, and I would let that soak for a couple of hours, and then take it out, rinse it, and put it in a bucket full of water, and it's ready to go and ready to dye. So this has an alum mordant in it, so we're going to put that in. It also falls in nicely as well when you put it in when it's wet. The next one I'm going to add is the skein that does not have any mordant on it. And it's also Blue-Faced Leicester. And so we're going to see what the difference is, if there is a difference. And then I've got room for two more. This is a merino, and it is not superwash. It's 100% organic merino, and we're going to put that in and see what that looks like. And then the last one, a lot of times when I'm dyeing, for demonstration purposes, I use cream colored yarn or white yarn. And you don't always have to do that. So I wanted to show you what it would look like if I used a gray yarn. And this it's gray, but I would also say that there's a hint of brown in it as well. And this is Blue-Faced Leicester and Masham. And so we're going to see what that looks like in the dye pot. And I've also pre-mordanted this as well with alum. Okay, so we are going to let that sit for 2 hours, and we're going to put it on a simmer. And then we're going to come back and look at it and see if we like the color. Fingers crossed. Okay, it's time to check on it and see whether or not it's ready to come out of the pot. What I'll do is I take my stick and I go fishing. And I'll look around and bring it up and see if I like the color, and if I'm happy with it, then I'll take it out. So the first one I'm going to take out is the merino. And that's a really nice yellow. Remember, we just squeeze it. So I'm going to put that in the pot, or bucket. Next one I will take out is the Masham. The Masham and BFL, Blue-Faced Leicester. So that's a completely different color. But remember, it went in as gray with a brown hue to it. Let me just hold that up beside the yellow. So that's from the same dye pot. Then we will bring out the this was the Blue-Faced Leicester with no mordant on it. It picked up a lot of color. Let's just see when I wash it. I'm going to wash it 4, 5, 6 times because I'm really going to try to get the color out of it and see whether or not it fades or not. Because I really want to see whether or not we needed a mordant when we were dyeing with Marigold. And then the last one is the Blue-Faced Leicester that had Alum mordant on it. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wash it. I get questions on how do you wash the wool. And so what I do with it is I like to get the color out. And so I will wash it until I get the color out. And I wash it in, it's slightly, I would say it's room temperature water. And I will just put it in the water, take it out, keep dunking it back and forth. And you know what I do? One of the tricks I use is I put a mason jar beside it because what I like to do is I want to have it clear. So I will be washing it, taking it out, and I will look at the water. So I'll wring the yarn out, and if it's clear in here, it's done. It means that there's not going to be any more color. What I'm going to do with this one though is I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make sure there's no color coming from it. I'm going to let it sit overnight, and then I'm going to wash it again because I want to test this to see whether or not the color is going to change. So I'm going to go off, wash this. I'll have it dried. I'll have it plumped up into skeins, and then we'll come back and talk about it. I'm back, and I just finished washing and drying the yarn. So let's take a look at it. The first thing we wanted to do was we wanted to see whether or not a mordant had an impact on the yarn. And so these are the two that were in our experiment. So this one had mordant on it. It had an alum mordant before we put it into the dye bath. And this one had no mordant at all. There's not a huge difference. I would say that this color is slightly more intense than this one, but there's not a huge difference in color. So from a color fast perspective, the mordant, I would say, wasn't really needed unless you want to go for this color. What I'm going to do with these next is I'm going to put them outside. I want to see if it's light fast, and I want to see whether or not this one fades faster than this one, or if they fade at all. So I'll let you know how that goes. The next thing we wanted to look at was how did the dye pot impact the color on our yarn. And so the first one we had was the merino. And so this is the organic merino that I put in. It is so nice and soft. But that's the yellow we got from it. And then I put in the BFL and Masham. And look at that. That's from the same dye pot. And remember, this one was gray with a slight brown hue to it. This one was white or off-white. And then we had the BFL, and the BFL was 100% BFL. So we've got 100% BFL, BFL and Masham, and the merino, all from the same dye pot. I will have a full description of what we covered today, along with the recipe in the show notes. So have a look at those. And also, if you have any questions for me, please do not hesitate to ask. You know where to find me at Kevin Boynitz. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you have a great week. Take care.